Hello, everybody.
Hi, Steve. How are you doing?
Good, except for the fact that we have drifts in our yard that are taller than I am.
What?
We have snow drifts that are as tall as a man.
I know. Well, it's a good night for Partisan Torah, huh?
It's always a good night for Partisan Torah.
Ah.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you all for tuning in here to Partners in Torah with Rabbi Landis on this beautiful night. So Steve says the music was scrambled. Are you hearing me okay now, Steve? Does everybody hear me okay? Okay, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Okay, sorry the music wasn't clear over there. I apologize. Probably my fault. Something I did, probably something I did technically. I'm always doing things technically wrong. But thank you all for tuning in tonight to our 8th and final installment of the Life and Legacy of Jewish Queens. We tonight are addressing a very, very interesting queen, a queen that quite possibly no one on this call has heard of, except for Joanne, who I know did a project on Beta Israel, and we're going to touch on the Beta Israel community tonight, more than touch on it, that we're going to be deeply involved in it. So, but nonetheless, she is a lady whose name comes up quite often in sources, both Jewish and not, and we figured it would be a interesting way to end our series. And not only is it an interesting way to end our series, but we'll see in many ways it's going to take the series full circle. Because for those of you who have been with us since the beginning, or for those of you tuning in later on Torah Anytime, and you can look through all of the different lectures we've had, or whatever it might be, you recall that the first lecture we gave was on the topic of the Queen of Sheba. And in many ways, we're coming full circle now to discuss Judith, who we're going to see at least seemingly has a connection to the Queen of Sheba. So with no further ado, we'll delve right in. But first, just in case there's anyone who's not planning to make it to the end, I do want to say or do a quick plug for our new series that is starting next week. I'm going to just bring up the schedule for that here. And this is our series beginning next week. And okay, there it is. The series for next week will be The True Religion, Righteous Converts. We will begin this next week with The Stranger Who Sojourns Among Us, Conversion and Judaism 101, and then it'll be another 7-week series there, touching on many famous converts to Judaism throughout the years. So again, we'll plug this again at the end, but for anyone who doesn't plan to stay to the end, you've got to see what's coming up next. Okay, with no further ado, jumping into our queen for tonight. First of all, we named her, for the sake of this discussion, we called her Judith. But that's even going to be a debate and discussion here if that's the name of the person we're even speaking about. Who we were speaking about is seemingly a Jewish queen of Ethiopia from the 10th century. Now, why I say her name even comes into question is because she is called by many, many different names. In fact, if you would want to Google her right now to figure out something about her or see anything about her, you would come up with the names Judith, Yodit, Gudit, Esther, Isato, Gwawa, Tirda Gabza, and probably several others, because she's seemingly known by many different names. But we're going to stick to the name Judith, even though in many scholarly writings, the most prominent and popular name is the name Gudit, but that is actually meant to be a pejorative, and we'll see why in a moment. But it's a pejorative meaning bad or destructive, and we'll see why she gets that label shortly. But we're going to call her Judith, which is just the anglicized version of Yehudit or Yehudis, the Jewish name, because that was seemingly the Jewish name she was known by. Okay, so who is she and what's this all about? If we look into many sources, especially in the Ethiopian historical record, the Ethiopian record accounts that there was a Jewish queen, a Jewish female queen, who was the queen of Ethiopia for around 20 to 30 years in the mid 10th century. Okay, so that's going to be the basis of our discussion. A Jewish queen in Ethiopia around the mid 10th century, and this queen usurped power from the Aksumite dynasty, which was the main ruling dynasty of Ethiopia for many, many centuries, what's interesting in the discussion is, according to Ethiopian tradition, the Aksumite dynasty is a descendant of Shlomo HaMelech, of King Solomon, and the Queen of Sheba. Again, if you remember back to that first discussion we talked about how the Queen of Sheba came to visit Jerusalem, had a child together with Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, and then goes back to her country of Sheba. And the Ethiopian tradition is that Queen of Sheba isn't in fact their founding queen, and the child born to Solomon and the Queen of Sheba was their first king, and therefore they maintain that their entire kingdom descends from the Queen of Sheba and from King Solomon. Now, their tradition says that this Jewish queen comes along and usurps the kingship from that dynasty. So at the ground floor, it seems like we quite possibly have a family feud, which, let's face it, every great conflict in history, or most great conflicts, start as family feuds. Just look at World War I if you need an example. World War I, even though it looked like it was a war between Germany and England and France and the Ottoman Empire and whatnot, it was a family feud. They were all first cousins pretty much. So at least at the surface, it looks like this too might have been a family feud, because we seem to have claims that both dynasties, both the dynasty of Judith and the Aksumite dynasty that preceded and, by the way, succeeded her, have Jewish roots. But let's delve in now to see what we can figure out from the historical writings. Again, a lot of the challenge in a discussion like Judith is that there's a lot of superficial writings about her, but not a lot of in-depth writing. So we have to really kind of piece things together to try and get the story straight. Okay. One of the first questions that comes up, and I think the question that we'll discuss first, because it'll give us our pretense for discussing this topic or not, is, was she in fact Jewish or not? Why do I ask that? Because there's actually a discrepancy and a debate within historical sources, within scholarly sources, as to who this queen was, and was she Jewish or was she quite simply non-Christian? Now, at that point, the Aksumite Empire had converted to Christianity. It had been a Christian nation for about 600 years at this point. And so therefore, was Yehudi just labeled as Jewish because she was not Christian? Or was she just a non-Christian pagan? Or was she in fact Jewish? So For the most part, if we look into most historical sources, including most Ethiopian sources, it would seem that she was in fact Jewish, as we're assuming, and that her lineage dates back to the Beta Israel community. We'll talk about them in a moment, but that will be in contradiction to what most Ethiopian sources say. So most Ethiopian sources say she was in fact Jewish, but she was a convert to Judaism when she married a Jewish prince from Syria. Most other sources say she was Jewish, but she was not a convert, that she dated back to the Beta Israel community, which was there long before. So first off, let's address who exactly the Beta Israel community is. I know we touched on it a little bit in the Queen of Sheba class, but we'll go into it again now. Okay, so the Beta Israel community, which if you follow, I won't say modern Israeli politics because it hasn't come up in Israel in quite some time, but at least modern Israeli politics when I was a kid, this was a really big deal. When the Falasha community was coming over from Ethiopia, and the question is what their status was, should the law of return apply to them, should it not apply to them, and that whole discussion for when it was happening. So what's the claim, or what's the lineage of the Beta Israel community? The Beta Israel community is a community that's been in Ethiopia for hundreds of years and claims to themselves be descendants from the tribe of Dan, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And they have a debate an internal debate as to where exactly they date back to. One source in the Beta Israel sources say that they go back to the time of Moses, that already from the time of Moses they made their way to Ethiopia. Others say that after the death of Solomon and the schism of the northern and southern kingdoms, that's when they made their way over to Ethiopia. And a third source says that it wasn't until the exile of the northern kingdom at the hand of the Syrians at roughly 150 years before the 150, 200 years. I'm sorry, roughly 550 years before the Common Era. So those are our three sources. Now, the Beta Israel community themselves do not claim to come from the Queen of Sheba. They do not make that claim. First of all, because we'll see in a moment, if they make that claim, they would essentially be putting their whole Jewish lineage or their Jewish claims out the window. So they claim that they were there either from the time of Moses or from the time of the splitting of the kingdom or from the time of the exile of the northern kingdoms. That is their internal claim themselves. And in truth, we have external Jewish sources dating to the early Middle Ages, the first of which is Rav Ovadia Bar Tanura, who writing in the late 15th century, and then later we have the Radvaz, who writes a little bit later than that, the same thing, but both of them give testimony to meeting Ethiopian Jews claiming lineage, claiming descendancy from the tribe of Dan. Now, we're going to see in modern times, Rav Ovadia Yosef used this claim, who was the chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel, used these claims to validate their lineage and to say that they did not need to convert to Judaism when they moved to Israel. That being said, the predominant opinion of the rabbinate, for sure the Ashkenazi rabbinate, is that they did in fact need to convert to Judaism upon coming to Israel. So the law of return, so to speak, applied to them, or at least the responsibility of the state of Israel was extended to them to bring them over to Israel. But and to settle the halachic question, they were asked to go through a conversion to answer any doubt on their lineage. But be it as it may, they are a group that has been in Ethiopia dating back a very long time, and their claim is to be Jewish, and they're basically accepted as such, with some halachic stipulations needing to take place. Okay, so now if that's the situation here, we have this kingdom of Beta, this group called Beta Israel. We're going to go with the idea that Yehudis is part of that group, is attached to that group, and that she's the one that overthrows the Akshamite dynasty. So let's now address the question as to whether or not this was a Jew against Jew, a brother against brother fight. So the Ethiopian national saga, which is known as Kibra Nagast, says that their their national story starts with the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, that the Queen of Sheba had a child by King Solomon, and his name was Menelik, and that he became the first king of the Ethiopian dynasty known as the Aksumite dynasty. Now, while our sages do corroborate the fact that the King Solomon had a child with the Queen of Sheba, they do not give any identity to the descendants or identify any single person except for one. They say that Nebuchadnezzar was a descendant of that relationship, and he was the one who eventually destroys the first temple. Now, the other issue that would pop up here with the Queen of Sheba and Solomon being defined as the antecedents of the Ethiopian national story is that Jewish sources are not 100% in agreement that Sheba was, in fact, Ethiopia. In fact, the Abarbanel says that Sheba was modern-day Yemen. And the Me'amloes and Josephus say it was Ethiopia. Now, again, if you know your geography, Yemen and Ethiopia are just separated by a little bit of water. But B'nai they're slightly different countries. But that is an interesting, geographical debate and discussion to be pointed out here, that it's not so 100% clear that Sheba was in fact Ethiopia. But okay, be it as it may, this will be a working premise. The working premise is that the Aksumite Empire descends from the Queen of Sheba through Menelik, and Judith is coming to us from Beta Israel. Okay. So what's going on? We seemingly have Ethiopia with fights going on between Jewish groups, and we in the rest of the Jewish world don't hear about it till the Middle Ages. What exactly is going on over here? So one thing we have to realize, as I mentioned briefly before, is that even though, according to the claims of the Ethiopian national story, the kingdom was connected to the Queen of Sheba, the Aksumite kingdom was a descendant of the Queen of Sheba, already in the 4th century, in roughly the year 325, the Ethiopian king Ezana was crowned as king of the Akshumites, and he had later fallen under the influence of Christian missionaries. And as we know how things usually happen in antiquity, that whatever religion your king or your emperor or your dictator or your czar was, that was the national religion of your country. So we see that Ezana had previously become Christian. In 325, he becomes the king of the Akshumites. And that would mean that at that point in the middle 4th century, Ethiopia, even though it might be true they descend from the Queen of Sheba and from King Solomon, by the year 325, it is a Christian country, and we're going to see, for the most part, never to return from that point forward. So therefore, if we have a dispute or a confrontation between the Beta Israel community and the Aksumite dynasty, it is, in fact, a Christian and Jewish group. It is Christian and Jewish groups fighting each other. Okay. Now, that gives us a sort of our basis on who the players are and who the belligerents are here in our conflict. Now we'll see what seemingly happened between the fight and between the conflict. First, I'll pause here for station identification just to see if there's any questions at this point. See if anything's been unclear. Any questions for clarity for our ground fight, for our ground war, our ground information? Okay, good deal. So we will continue. Okay. As usually would happen, even though you have a country that converts to a certain religion, you will often have people of the original team, of the original religion, who aren't so happy with that. And that seemingly is the development of the Beta Israel community as a separate community. So if we want to sort of mesh together everything we're saying here, we have the Beta Israel community, whose claim is that they date back to 500-600 year BCE at the latest, is coming to Ethiopia. So the latest that they date themselves is the exile, the 10 northern tribes of Israel, and that would already put them in Ethiopia, possibly before that, but that's where they would put themselves in Ethiopia. We have the Ethiopian claim of the Aksumite Empire, that they come from the Queen of Sheba and therefore have been there since the Queen of Sheba. So this goes back to it's about 800 about 800 before the Common Era, roughly, and that's when they've been there. So if we bring those two stories together, that would mean that somewhere around the 5th century BCE, 4th century BCE, somewhere around there, you have this group that becomes known as Beta Israel, move to Ethiopia. They find a Jewish group there, descending from the Queen of Sheba, and they live seemingly in harmony until, as we're going to see, the 4th century of the Common Era. So for, give or take 800, 900 years, they live in a certain amount of harmony with each other. What happens then? As we just mentioned, the Aksumite Empire becomes Christian. And there are those amongst Ethiopia who don't want to be Christian. They want to remain Jewish. So at that point, there is a breakaway kingdom. So when the Aksumite kingdom becomes Christian, there's a breakaway kingdom known as the Simeon community. Possibly the name is rooted in Semite, I'm not exactly sure. But the Simeon community, the Simeon dynasty, which is our Beta Israel community. So the Beta Israel community at this point has its own dynasty because they break away from the Aksumite dynasty. So you have the Aksumite dynasty now controlling most of Ethiopia, practicing Christianity, and you have the Simeon dynasty, which we're going to refer to as Beta Israel, that's practicing Judaism, and they have broken away from the Aksumite Empire. Now, there's constant strife between the two kingdoms. The Simeon Empire is much smaller. They just want to defend themselves. The Aksumite Empire is regularly trying to take over the kingdom and bring them back under their rule. And this comes to a head at the time of our story tonight, in roughly the mid-10th century of the Common Era. There's a king of the Simeon Empire known to us as Gidon. And when he's the king, the Aksumite Empire attacks the Beta Israel Simeon Empire in an all-out war, and the goal of trying to reclaim the kingdom and bring them back into control of themselves. Now, in that war, Gidon is successful in fending off the Aksumite Empire, but he actually falls in battle and does not survive. But his right-hand woman in that battle was none other than his daughter, you guessed it, Yehudit, Judith, our queen for tonight, and she takes over the kingdom after the death of her father and continues to wage the war that her father had fallen in, to not only avenge her kingdom, but to avenge the blood of her father. And she makes some very strategic military alliances, and she goes from the position of the successful defense of her father, switching over to the offensive. And makes an offensive attack against the Aksumite Empire. Now, it happens to be that at the time, the Akshumites are going through their own difficulties, their own family feud, their own debate and discussion of leadership and who should be in charge. That was also going on amongst the Akshumites. So Judith is able to not only take advantage of her father's success before her, but the internal strife that was going on in the Aksumite Empire. She's able to conquer the Aksumite Empire. She eradicates the royal family completely. She eradicates any Christian semblance within the kingdom. She destroys every church. She wipes out every Christian religious leader. And she now makes Judaism the state religion. And this, by the way, now we can understand why it is that Christian sources refer to her as the pejorative that we mentioned before, as Godid, of being a a bad or destructive lady, because that's what she did to the Christians. By the way, it's a general rule in with Christian sources that again, definitely from antiquity, maybe not in modern times, but definitely from antiquity, that anyone in Christian sources that is referred to as good is usually pretty bad, and anyone referred to as bad is usually okay. One famous example of this is the Good Samaritan. There was nothing good about the Samaritans, right? They were not good at all. But the Christians referred to them as a Good Samaritan, and one of the ways they got their name as a Good Samaritan is because they sided with the Christians over the Jews in Israel at the time of that struggle. So, but be it as it may, there's nothing good about the Samaritans, and there's nothing good about the Akshamites in this war, but there is something good about Judith, Yehudit, because she was fighting to avenge Judaism in the Jewish country that was trying to remain Jewish, and in so doing is able to take over all of Ethiopia for at least 20 to 30 years before the Akshamites, after her death, will get the upper hand and once again make it a Christian empire, pushing Beta Israel back to being a small subsection of the Ethiopian empire. Now, there is one other very interesting, I guess, point or statement or idea that you will find in the sources as to something that Judith did during this war. And the Ethiopians accuse her of destroying the Ark of the Covenant when she took over the country. Now, what does that mean? Okay, what is the Ark of the Covenant? Now, again, we addressed this, I believe, briefly in our class on the Queen of Sheba, but the Ark of the Covenant was the holiest item, if you will, in the Beis Hamikdash, in the first temple, and in the Mishkan before that. Now, it did not exist in the second temple. The whole 420 years of the second temple, there was never an Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant ceased to be a thing, a structure, if you will, in the second temple, but it was definitely there for the whole first temple. Now, the Kebra Nagas that we mentioned before, the Ethiopian national saga, tells that what happened with the Ark of the Covenant. It tells that at a certain point, Menelik, again, that Ethiopian prince, bore to the Queen of Sheba and to King Solomon, according to Ethiopian tradition, that he at one point goes to Ethiopia to visit his father, goes to Jerusalem to visit his father Solomon. And after that visit, makes his way back to Ethiopia to reunite with his mother. Now, on his way back to Ethiopia, it is discovered that one of the men in his entourage, actually stole the Ark of the Covenant from the temple and replaced it with a replica that was not the real Ark of the Covenant, but that looked like the real Ark of the Covenant, and that this replica was going to fool the Jews from this point forward, and the real Ark of the Covenant was there with them on their way back to Ethiopia. And Menelik figured that since no one had died in the process of stealing and capturing and taking the Ark of the Covenant thus far, then therefore it must be God's blessing that they come back to Ethiopia with them. And he continued to take the Ark of the Covenant back to Ethiopia with them. They build a special temple to the Ark in Ethiopia. It's still there today. There is a guardian to the temple that guards this place. He is supposedly the only person who has ever seen the Ark of the Covenant. No one else has seen it. No one else knows there's anything in there. But he lets us know that it's there and it is safe and it is under control of the Ethiopians. Now, I'll give you one of two options with this story. Either one, it's completely fabricated, and whatever is there is the temple of the Ark in Ethiopia is just completely made up, and there's nothing inside, and the guardian of the Ark is nothing more than a charlatan. Or B, there is some kind of replica of the Ark of the Covenant that is in fact inside of that temple and is being guarded by his life with the guardian, but he's just guarding a replica that was made by someone later to pull the wool over the eyes of everybody watching. According to Jewish tradition, the Ark of the Covenant stayed safe and fine in Jerusalem until shortly before the destruction of the temple, when the writing was on the wall for the destruction of the first temple. At that point, the King King Yoash, put the Ark of the Covenant into hiding, and a special in a special place underneath the Temple Mount, and there it has remained, and there it will remain until the building of the third temple. Now, you can ask the question, why didn't it come back during the second temple? And the simple answer to that question is the second temple was never worthy of that. It never reached the level. It was never a full reenactment or rebuilding or restatement of the first temple. In fact, I have another article coming out shortly about the exile of the Jews of Spain, and the Jews of Spain seemingly date their heritage back to the first temple. And we see that after the rebuilding of the second temple, that there were those communities that were already in exile after the destruction of the first temple that just didn't go back for the second temple. In fact, the majority of Jews stay in exile because they knew that the second temple and the second Commonwealth was not going to be on the full level as the first temple. So be it as it may, anyone who makes a claim that the Ark of the Covenant is in Ethiopia, it's not there. It's in a special place under the Temple Mount. But by the way, I should state that this did give us a pretense or an idea for some great movies like Indiana Jones and the Lost Ark. It's stories like this one and others that the Ark of the Covenant was in all kinds of weird places all around the world that gave us the first great Indiana Jones movie. And I love Indiana Jones, so for that it was worth it. But be it as it may, it is in direct contradiction to Jewish tradition that says the Ark of the Covenant was never touched, always stayed in Jerusalem, and was put into hiding before the destruction of the first temple, which is where tradition is. So be it as it may, that is our story of Judith. She only ruled for, like I said, about 20 or 30 years before she passed away and was eventually overthrown, and the kingdom goes back to becoming a full Aksumite kingdom and going back to practicing Christianity. And the Beta Israel community is left as its own small community until it later experiences significant anti-Semitism and after the founding of the State of Israel, and they are airlifted to Israel in the operation that we are all familiar with. And that, my friends, is the story of Judith, our Ethiopian Jewish queen. Do I have any questions, comments, or concerns, or good jokes, or good stories from the peanut gallery? Go for it. Joanne, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Great.
So I have a few questions.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna.
Hi, Sophie.
Because, what was my first question? So one of them, totally not fully related, is what tribe were Georgian Jews supposedly come from? I'm asking this because when I've been at my brother-in-law's parents' house and they're Georgian, their Siddur is in Georgian and Hebrew. Georgian writing looks very close to Amharic to me. The characters look very, very similar. So I'm almost wondering if maybe they're both from the tribe of Dan. I don't know. Is that a crazy thought?
That is a very, it's a good question. I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that one way or the other. I don't know a lot about the Georgian community, although it is a very old, Jewish community dating back. I believe that most of those communities date back, or many of them date back to the destruction of the first temple. But beyond that, I don't know. It's a good question. I'll have to put it to the research committee and we'll have to find out.
Okay.
So.
I feel like I have another trip to the Library of Congress in my future.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Regarding the Ark, is there anybody like the quasi Ark that's in Ethiopia? Have any outsiders ever, like archaeologists, ever been able to see any information, or is it just like this, kind of like the, what are those guards that they have at the Vatican that they're sworn to secrecy, nobody really knows what's going on? Is it kind of like that?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's pretty much you have the only person who's ever seen it, who's ever been allowed to see it, is the guardian. There's been even the king of Ethiopia or whoever the present day leaders of Ethiopia, even he has not been privileged to see it, but he trusts, he trusts his guardian. But that is that is as far back as it goes, that the guardian is the only, even with their claim, their guardian is the only one who's actually seen it. And there's no one else who's even been, inside. Inside. So, yeah, no one can go in it. It's 1 second. What's the place called? It's called so there's a church there now, and it's called the Church of the Old Lady Mary of Zion. That's what it's called now. But it's but inside is where they say the Ark of the Covenant is, and it's only the guardian of the Ark who is ever supposedly seen it. So,
this is like something that passes on through one family or something, assumingly.
Yeah, exactly. It stays within. I believe there's 1 second. I believe that there is also. So I thought there's a whole group, and he's just the head of the group. But but whatever it is, but he's the only one. So you can go and you can talk to him if you can get to him, but he's not going to let you. Exactly.
So within and if I don't know if anybody else saw this, there was another group of Beta Israel that were just airlifted from Ethiopia to Israel like yesterday, like 2000, which I think is amazing. Because there really hasn't been a big group since Operation Solomon.
Yeah, that is interesting. That is interesting. There's just, I did not know that there was
waiting for years and years around the embassy, that they had set up these communities. So
around the embassy?
Around, I think, by the Israeli embassy in Addis Ababa. And because people who had tried to get in on Operation Solomon, some of the people couldn't get in, and I think some of them were the Falashmura, and so there was a question. But I think most of them already had family in Israel, and didn't make it, and were waiting for the next opportunity. And the fact that 2,000 people went, I just
wow, and in the middle of COVID, nonetheless.
Right. So it's my other, and
that's crazy. I did not see or hear anything about that.
It was on. I don't think it was on Humans of Judaism. It may have been like from one of the Israeli newspapers. I saw it. I don't remember where I saw it. I'll find it and I'll send it over.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's for sure fascinating. Wow. Oh, wow. Very cool. Very, very cool. Yeah, I mean, again, for people my age or older, we all remember what it was like when the Ethiopian community started coming over. First days went into America, and it was very strange for many of us who never met Jews of color before, and all of a sudden you had these Jews of color, and in Israel it was really it was very shocking where they came, 14, 15, 20,000, how many it was, 20,000, I forget the exact number, but it was a large group that came over, and it definitely was an experience for everyone, an experience for everyone. Sorry, I gave you totally the wrong number. I believe it was it was up to 125,000. Sorry, I have here, and in total. I believe that's 1 second. Is that number right? Joanne, help me here. You're the one who did the research.
I have to find my paper, and I'd have to hobble over to my bookshelf to go grab one of my books.
So let me see 1 second. I do have it here. 1 second.
See if I can find it.
I'm sorry. I was wrong. No. I'm sorry. Today, the community is about 125,000 Jews.
Yes, 125,000 in Operation Moses sounds really high.
Now, Operation Moses was small compared to Solomon, because Operation Moses was only.
Moses was the first one in 84, and Solomon was in 91.
Right, exactly. So let's see here. I had it here before. So Operation Moses. Here we go. No, I thought I had it here. I guess I don't have it in my notes either.
I'll try to.
Yeah, but that's it. But the number today is obviously after there's been, here we go. So Operation Solomon, which is the big one, was about 14,000.
Uh-huh.
Operation Moses, which was much smaller, was between 2 to 5,000.
It says, well, what I'm reading, granted, this is Wikipedia. I'm not pulling up my paper right now. Wikipedia is saying 8,000 in Operation Moses.
Okay. Anyways, those are about the numbers, roughly. But anyhow, it was definitely a fascinating time for the Jewish people, that's for sure.
So I have another question, and I'm sorry that I've totally taken over.
No, it's okay.
Regarding the hopefully real Ark hidden under the Temple Mount, how do we know that the Waqf hasn't done anything to it since they control the Temple Mount?
So, in truth, we don't. For just some background to that question, so the Waqf is a Muslim religious group that after the Six-Day War, when Israel took control of the Temple Mount, that Levi Eshkol and Moshe Dayan made the decision, which has been hotly contested and debated ever since, but to turn or really keep the rule of the Temple Mount under the control of the Waqf. And the reason why that's considered so controversial from a Jewish perspective is that's the place of our temple. Like, why are you putting it or leaving it under Muslim rule? But from a sociopolitical standpoint, had they not done that, the postscript of the Six-Day War could have been a lot more complicated than it was. Not that it's been great, because in many ways the Israelis thought after the Six-Day War they'd be waiting by the phone and within a week have peace from every one of the belligerents. But be it as it may, maybe had they not given the Temple Mount back to the Waqf, then they would have called. But we can debate this in another lecture. But so Julianne's asking is, if the Waqf is technically in control of the Temple Mount, how do we know they haven't found the Ark of the Covenant and destroyed it? Now, one other, I guess, prelude to that question is we do know that the Waqf digs under the Temple Mount with the goal of trying to disrupt the archaeological evidence to Jewish lineage, right? To the fact that we were there first, the fact that we had a temple there. That's one of the things that they are digging and trying to mess up and trying to do things with when they do dig. So Jordan, the short answer to your question is we don't know for sure. We don't know. We don't know they didn't find it and destroy it. That being said, while we don't like the fact that they dig, there was an agreement made that they always made claims that they needed to dig for architectural purposes, structural purposes, for this, for that, and they would take all of the I don't know what the excavated dirt, I don't know what the right term is for it, and they bring it to a certain place in Jerusalem, and then archaeologists could sift through it there. It actually was considered a tourist attraction for a while, that you might still be able to go there and sift through the dirt and you'll find certain things. But that was at least the agreement made with the Waqf, that we would have access to at least the excavated dirt that they dug up, and so anything significant has been found and documented and reported, and there's been no record of finding the Ark of the Covenant. So to the best of my knowledge, nothing's been found over there, and we have no reason to believe it hasn't. But hey, anything's possible nowadays.
Did any Beta Israel kind of trace their lineage to Judith?
So since she is such a mysterious character, essentially such a mysterious character as it is, it's hard. It's hard because we know so little about her. Our only real solid sources that she existed are Ethiopian sources. It's not like we have any DNA record of her to look at. So it's I've never heard any claims like, oh, we come from Judith. I've never heard such claims, but you know, anything's possible. I mean, one thing I do know is as I said, you know, I said briefly, is that the Beta Israel community does not claim to come from the Queen of Sheba. They do not lay that as their claim. They claim to slightly post-date her, but they at one point in their story, there were those in their community that did make that claim, but they do not make that claim anymore. They do not try to make that claim. So, yeah. Okay, I just we had something, a question typed here. Let me, 1 second here for Janice. So interesting, a group of Ethiopian Jews, Christian group, raising money for Ethiopian Jews. Interesting.
Yeah, they sent me an email asking for money to help fund those 2,000 Ethiopian Jews this month.
Oh, there you go. Look at that. Cool. Hey, Joanne, check that out. Check out that link. That's very cool. Yeah, so that's another source for what Joanne was talking about. That's very cool. And they mentioned it right away in the you know, in the midst of coronavirus. Yeah, in the midst of amid coronavirus. Yeah. Interesting. International Christian Embassy Jerusalem. I don't know what that is, but at least it's interesting. Interesting. Wow. Oh, good stuff. Good stuff. Okay. Awesome. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Good jokes.
Are you going to talk about her cutting the head off that general?
Yeah, so that is most likely that is probably confusing two different Judiths. The Judith that is famous for cutting a head off a general is probably the Judith from the Hanukkah story. There's with the onset of Hanukkah, there's a story about the daughter of the Hashmonaim, the Maccabees, who preempted the Hanukkah war. And what she did was that there was a Greek law that the night of a Jewish girl's wedding, she had to be with the local Greek general before she could be with her husband. And Jewish tradition says that Judith, the daughter of the Maccabees, instead of being with the Greek general, she fed him milk, got him tired, and beheaded him, and then brought the head out to instigate her brothers to the Hanukkah war. That being said, our Judith from Ethiopia was definitely known as a vicious warrior. And it can be assumed that she probably beheaded a bunch of generals as well, and the likes of her namesake from 1,500 years before. No, from about 1,000 years before. So we don't have any direct story of any beheadings, but they are definitely possible once we know the character we're dealing with. So, okay, anything else? Good deal. So let me just, I'm going to once again make a plug here for our next series. Give me 1 second here. Okay, so our next series will begin next week. True Religion, Righteous Converts, starting with the subject of the stranger who sojourns among you, Conversion, Judaism 101, and we'll touch on all of these fun topics and fun personalities of Jewish history who've converted to Judaism, and I look forward to doing it together with you. So with no further ado, I will wish everybody a good evening and look forward to being back with you next week. Everyone have a great evening. Thank you.